Thank you, Z.
At this time, I would like to pivot and introduce our next guests. Michael Sheets of CNBC, space reporter extraordinaire, and Steve Isakowitz, CEO of the Aerospace Corporation, both with Steve, thank you very much for joining us. A very interesting and illustrious career. I will let Michael continue your introduction. And Michael is the space reporter to follow. Get on his Twitter, get on his social media. If you want to know what's going on in this ecosystem, you better be following Michael here. And one of the things, as he mentioned in our space talk that we had earlier, he's a chronicler. And really provides an amazing perspective where he also helps people understand the history and what that means moving forward. And Steve and Michael, I'm going to leave you gentlemen to have what I know is going to be an amazing chat on the workforce of the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Z, and appreciate that really kind introduction. I have been really focused on not just the space industry, but what it means to have a business in space. And so my coverage at CNBC, for those unfamiliar, has really focused a lot on the underlying backbone of the industry. How do companies earn revenue? How do companies successfully set up stable businesses and really move out into the public sphere? And in a way that so many people talk about how there was a change in the technology sector about 20, 30 years ago, to where today every company is a tech company. We're seeing again this discussion and this repeated idea of every company slowly becoming a space company, where the likes of rideshare businesses here in I'm in Brooklyn, those companies using technology that's fundamentally based in space technologies. But for today's discussion on the future of work, I'm just absolutely honored to be joined by Steve Isakowitz here and understanding a little bit more about how Aerospace Corp sees the future of work, the future of the space industry's workforce as a whole. So before we get into the specifics about working in the space industry, Steve, I want to ask you why you think so much is happening every day. I mean, I, as a reporter, just feel the intensity writing article after article on just the developments and milestones. But what makes this such an exciting time to be in the space business?
First of all, Michael, thanks for inviting me here. And Zahir, thanks for also that introduction. It's a real honor for me to be here and also to be part of the Aerospace Corporation, as you said. Michael, you're absolutely right. This is an incredibly exciting time in America's space program. And I would actually argue, although we have a very storied history in this country in the space program, this is literally, I believe, the most exciting time to be in space. I think it tops all the other times that we've had things going on in space. Now, why do I say that? When I graduated from MIT, which seems like a long time ago, I remember I was getting my aerospace engineering degree, and I was interested in a word that no one ever talked about a whole lot back then. It's called entrepreneurship. And I remember taking a class at the Sloan School on entrepreneurship and trying to figure out, is there a business model for space? And everything I came back to said, yes, if you can start off with a few $100 million, there is a place for a startup in the space program. Well, obviously that's not practical. So that brings us to the present, where I think a few things have really made some transformational changes and why I say it's so exciting. Number one is the economics, the cost of building these small satellites and these access to space on these launch vehicles that are reducing the cost have really made it such that not only can you start a company, but we got kids in college, even in high school, that are putting things in space. You have other nations that are doing it. You heard from the previous panel, they talked about things like SPACs and so on. There's just a euphoria right now on all things space on the market. Second is the technology, with artificial intelligence and machine learning, automation, 3D manufacturing, optics, quantum computing, and so on. The private sector really has taken over in terms of the R&D. It was only a couple decades ago that probably over 2/3 of the funding actually came from the federal government for R&D. That has completely flipped. And so now you're seeing the private sector really outpacing, and it's really driving a lot of the changes we're now seeing in space. Third, the amount of changes that are taking place. We have three sectors of space. We have the national security, the civil, and the commercial side. If you look at the history of the space program, usually one of them is going through a change at any particular time. We are finding that all three of them are really going through transformational changes. On the national security side, it's because of the threats that are out there. On the civil side, NASA trying to do some really ambitious things in their exploration program. And on the commercial side, for the reasons I just cited. So just to wrap up the sort of why it's exciting, you just have to look in the headlines today. I mean, look, Perseverance being on Mars with an amazing set of videos coming back. Ingenuity being that little drone that's going to fly in the next couple of weeks. You got things like Starship, which captivate people on something that's really hard to do. Small launch vehicle companies, a number of them that are going to be flying for the first time this year. These concepts of proliferated LEO constellations with small satellites that can do communications, geolocation, address climate change issues, and even private human spaceflight and private trips to the moon. You're going to have tourism companies like Galactic and Blue Origin that's doing it. And you even have startup companies that are going to put small vehicles, hopefully on the surface of the moon later this year. I mean, this is a pretty amazing set, Michael, of things that are going on.
It really is, Steve. And I think that's a wonderful overview of just the variety of things that are happening all at once. You know, it's not one specific sector. It's not just the tourism. It's not just building small satellites. It's the whole combination of everything. And that leads really well into our next question. I want to talk about what it means to actually work in the space industry. I mean, how do you define the space workforce? Does it mean that you're an astronomer, a spacecraft engineer, and a software developer, or is it even broader than that?
Yeah, you know, I'll share a story with you. When I was at my last job, it was a startup company. It was a pretty tense job. Again, you work at these startups, you never know how long you're going to last till you fall off the cliff. I remember you walking in every morning, the side door into the factory, and there was a whiteboard there. And somebody kept writing things on the whiteboard, like today's a big day, or, you know, wonderful job, everybody on the test, or, you know, hey, you know, let's be excited. We got some amazing things coming up. And actually, after every morning when I come in, I would like look at that little sign and like, you know, kind of cheered me up as I was going into the office. After a while, I was sort of wondering who wrote it. And so I started asking my managers and folks in my workforce, and no one actually took credit for it. Well, after sleuthing for a little bit, I found out that there was a young woman on the janitorial staff that would come in at night and she would just write these wonderful things on it. And I think it was an example of, you know, you don't have to be the head of the organization or the chief engineer to feel that you're part of something greater. So, and I think that's the point it's really embedded in your question. I do think there's opportunities for everybody to participate on the excitement that I talked about. For example, certainly there's the operational side of the house. You know, you need people in finance and HR, legal, communications, facilities, supply chain. These are the people that, frankly, at the end of the day, you don't really have an operating entity. You will not succeed unless you do this well. On the manufacturing side, you don't need PhDs on manufacturing, but you do need smart people that are operating some very sophisticated machines with regards to production. And you do have a dependency, frankly, on some of these vocational and community colleges to produce some of the talent that's coming through. And then I think you don't actually have to be part of the organization. I think what we're seeing in space today is what I would call the democratization of space. This is the notion that you don't have to be a great power or a national agency to be part of the space program. People today can participate. In fact, you could buy a ticket today to fly into space to do things. And to me, that really has opened up the frontiers to the rest of us.
Before I want to get into our further discussion, I do want to key in on one thing that you just mentioned there, that democratization idea, because I've seen some criticism of democratization of space where people go, okay, yeah, maybe it's not only NASA and only large national governments that are launching people and payloads to space, but I don't have tens of millions or even hundreds of thousands of dollars to send a research payload, let alone put myself into space. What do you say in response to that in terms of how people should understand what democratization of space really means, especially in a perspective of making kind of space more achievable and actually broadening the space economy beyond a more fundamental, like, kind of niche?
Well, I mean, I guess a couple of points. One is, you know, there's different ways to be part of the space program. You could be the one that's in space. You know, we always think of astronauts, and I'm going to speak to that in a second. There's also, you know, to be part of space, like, again, what I refer to the Mars Perseverance lander. I mean, for, you know, to actually watch that thing land with that video showing it landing on the surface. I mean, that was about as immersive an experience as anyone could get sitting in your living room, you know, watching that. But on the economics of actually participating, if you actually want to go into space, I just look at the fact that, when we used to launch astronauts on the space shuttle, a space shuttle, was roughly, $1 billion a launch, carry 6 people. That's 150 million, 200 million an astronaut. The cost dropped a little bit when we went to the Russians and they started charging 70, 80 million dollars today, to fly astronauts. Today, we're talking maybe the low 10 millions to go into orbit. And if you don't have that kind of in your pocket change, there are these companies like Galactic and so on that are now measured in hundreds of thousands. These are still not cheap numbers to actually have the experience going into space. But if you look at any technology in the early years, everything is expensive, right? And even the very first iPhones were, whatever, $10,000, $15,000 to have your own sort of big brick that you can carry at the side of your face. The costs come down. I anticipate over time the same things will happen in space. Costs have dropped dramatically, and I think they'll continue to drop. I think there'll be the equivalent of a Moore's law for space as there has been for the microelectronics industry.
More specifically, I mean, this morning, Aerospace Corporation Center for Space Policy and Strategy released a report on leadership, specifically on the needs surrounding developing future space workers. And I want to start off our discussion about this report, which is really fascinating and quite unique in terms of addressing a need in the overall industry. And I want to kind of open the floor in terms of how you think other leading organizations, whether it's NASA, the Pentagon, top private companies, how do they help open more opportunities for people to reach the level of being both a highly skilled worker, but also just to tap into the space industry at large?
Yeah, Michael, thanks for bringing out that. We were delighted to release that report to coincide with today's panel, fireside chat discussion here. So thank you for putting that out. I encourage folks to go on our website to read about it. But some of the things that we call out in there that I do think it's a great opportunity for the government to really lean in on is, looking for those public-private partnerships. I do think the government can do a lot with our educational system, but I do think it's the power of the private sector that really attracts the kind of talent and excitement we need to really bring folks into this industry. And I think that involves really looking at the curriculum that we teach our students to kind of draw their interest in. We often see that, when you go into elementary schools, there's a lot of interest in these fields and these technical fields, and then it sort of drops off pretty quickly as you get into the middle school and high school years. I think there's a lot we can do in the curriculum and bringing these real life examples. I think there's more we could do with the teachers. I think there's more we can do with underrepresented groups. Second, I think as called out in the report, is we need to do more in expanding the candidate pool. We've got to make sure that all of America has the benefit of being part of the STEM K through 12, opportunities that are out there. And I think there's things we could do at the university level with regards to research that can make that research really relevant and exciting for some of the things that are going on, that it's sort of a nice bridge for students to go directly into their area of interest. I also think we've got to redefine a little bit of the space job itself with regards to how we think about training. I'm a huge fan of internships. I think that's a great way to sort of bring students in and give them sort of hands-on experience, whether it's an apprenticeship or otherwise. And I know we'll probably get into it, but I think online learning, because of the whole COVID situation, I think has really opened up our eyes as we go forward. So I think these are things that the government can do and the private sector can do in terms of working together.
On your first point there, especially when it comes to these kinds of partnerships, I was curious if you could give me maybe an example of an organization and who they partnered with or how they did it, because that, talking about it at a macro level is helpful for understanding that there's a need here. But I'd be curious to hear, maybe an example that you know of in that Aerospace Corp was studying to kind of identify what these could be modeled after. And maybe it's not the only, model out there, but maybe if you have one.
Sure. And as I mentioned, I think internship programs is a great way to do it, to go into these schools, and particularly to go after some of the schools where we find that we're sort of underrepresented or the students or kids in those communities might have as much opportunity. So whether it's to bring them in through an internship program, whether it's to bring them into our campus, whether it's to find a way, like one of the things that we get actually pretty involved in at Aerospace is asteroid defense. We are in the business of doing space situational awareness, to be more aware of satellites, space junk, and frankly, other natural phenomena in space. One of the ones that always captures the imagination of students is, what wiped out the dinosaurs. How do we know if an asteroid is coming our way? How far can we detect it? And what can we do to avoid it? So we have done things where we bring in kids into our campus and we actually run them through scenarios. And what's great about it is it involves not only the engineering and the science and physics of asteroids and orbitology and trying to understand what it takes to actually move something that's of a massive scale or destroy it, but it also gets into sort of ethical issues on what you should do and how do you inform other nations, and how do you work to get some of these tough political discussions if there was something coming your way. I find that the kids, when they have sort of like these hands-on things, they get pretty darn excited when they really see sort of these real life applications, and they sort of have that motivation as to, hence, this is why I want to go on and get that degree.
Well, it sounds like kids are interested in, kind of mundane, normal, everyday stuff like the end of the world and asteroids destroying the Earth. So I'm curious, and you can speak to this very personally, as a space leader in the industry, what ways do you see that leaders like yourself can raise awareness of education and mentorship opportunities? I know the report talks a bit about raising awareness, but I'm curious to kind of key in a little bit more on what raising awareness really looks like on just a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, so part of it is that, like I said, we have a lot of really exciting things that are going on. I think one of the things that has done a better job of capturing the excitement of students today is sort of the rapid changes that I mentioned up front, that are going on. Very much during most of our space program, the kinds of activities we undertook were sort of many years, if not decades, in the making. It takes a long time to do some of these things, and it continues to take a long time. But more and more, we are finding that through sort of rapid development, that some of these things that took maybe a decade, we knew it in 5 years, 3 years, even 1 year turnaround from someone saying, I have an idea, to actually having a small satellite that you could put in space and fly. So I think that has sort of created excitement. And I think to sort of find ways to share that, to sort of attract the talent is really critical. You mentioned also the role of a leader. I think one of the things in modern corporations is there's much more awareness as to the benefits of the diversity of your workforce. I think there's now increasingly sort of well-established reasons why you really want a very well-defined, a very diverse workforce. Among other things, I think it expands the creativity when you have people coming in with different perspectives and different backgrounds. I think it improves decision-making. You don't want a team of yes people. You want people that engage in the kind of discussions because they say, yeah, I hear you, but I see it differently. I think you actually get increased productivity. I think you have more enhanced employee engagement and retention. And I think overall, it's frankly good for the company. It's good for the company's reputation when students hear that you're a very inviting place to bring into it. So I think a modern leader has to be very sort of focused on this aspect of it as well.
I want to shift our conversation a little bit and focus on some of the trends that you're seeing in the space industry at large. We opened this conversation talking about how much the industry is changing, how each of the three sectors are really seeing so much new involvement and so much more investment, especially on the private side. But what major changes have you seen in the space workforce in, say, the past decade, or maybe identify some distinct trends that you see around hiring in space?
I think the big changes that I've seen is certainly, in some of the, what I call the hard skills and the science and technology skills. We are seeing increasingly interest in what I would call the deep technology, the AI, machine learning. A lot of what we're doing these days is very much focused on things we're referring to as digital engineering. And this is trying to take more and more of what we do and to look at things like modeling and simulation as we go forward. Increasingly, we're actually hiring people outside the industry. We at Aerospace have been hiring people from the computer gaming industry to come in, given their sort of unique skills and doing what they do for fun, to actually work on real world problems. And I'm also, amazed how we're able to attract them. I ask them and they often say, well, it's one thing to do a game. It's one thing if it's a real world situation. Also, there's the soft skills that I think we're looking for in the changes. We're looking for individuals that are sort of more collaborative, adaptable, looking for creativity and having a strong communication skill. I think more and more we're seeing people with, I think, an entrepreneurial mindset. It used to be that when you would get a PhD, you're going to go on to teach or go into a lab. More and more, I'm finding PhDs walking around with a business plan in their hand as they get their degree, thinking about how they're going to apply this to solve problems that they think they can solve. I think we're also seeing some of the changes in tenure. It used to be people would go get a job for 20 years, 10 years. Now we're seeing 5 years, 3 years. So particularly in some of the early career folks, we're seeing sort of more of the turnover on it. And then finally, remote. Again, as I mentioned earlier, with COVID, I think we're seeing that you don't always have to be in the office. You could be at home. In fact, you might not even have to be in the location where the company is located. I think this is going to be really interesting to watch as we go forward, because I do think this is another way of really opening up the opportunities to participate in space where you don't have to be in high-priced locations like Los Angeles or New York or DC, but you can be in places that are frankly more affordable, better quality of life, and then it makes it easier for individuals to participate.
That last point, especially with remote work and how it's changing things, I think that's another key topic area and a part of this discussion, because when I talk to people at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, the discussion was centered around how does the space industry possibly move forward? I mean, you're trying to get things in space that are pieces of hardware that you need to be in person working on, right? That perception seems to have been lifted a lot as the industry was able to make a lot of progress. And in many ways, most parts only suffered a temporary setback at the very beginning of remote work as people started to kind of figure out these hybrid models and moving forward. I'm curious to see what other long-term impacts you see from the remote work shift, and maybe how it's different in the space industry versus in other industries.
Yeah, it's been kind of an interesting experience. Things that we thought were difficult or impossible before COVID suddenly fell in the realm of the possible. One of the things that we do at the Aerospace Corporation is we have our equivalent of a launch control center, which we usually pack in, or roughly 70 people in this one location. It's sort of as you picture it, with big monitors, very involved in the countdown and dealing real time with technical issues as they come up to address it. Under COVID, we couldn't do that. And yet we were still able to launch. Why? Because we just sort of used modern technologies of having secure networking capability that allowed people to be in remote locations. There's still some people that had to be sort of physically next to each other, but probably over 2/3 of those involved in it were able to operate from a remote location. And as we think about it, we're thinking to myself, this really might open up other opportunities in terms of others we can engage in terms of actually solving problems that you don't physically have to be there, but you can be sort of, virtually, present to try to solve things. Some things are still hard to get around. I mean, when you're still building hardware, you still kind of have to have people in locations. But outside of sort of those sort of few unique areas, I do think this really has opened up the possibilities of things like augmented reality and other modern tools to give people that sort of immersive feel to be part of that. I think we're going to see space as one of the leading industries involved in that. And I personally am going to be really interested in watching how others are adapting to this new environment. I do think it's going to be key for getting the kinds of skilled individuals that you want. Again, won't necessarily want to move into locations, but really want to be part of these unique opportunities.
Now, I know we're almost out of time here, but I do want to get in one last question on the kind of government regulation side of things. And this is an issue that's been highlighted recently, and I've been reporting on it as it's been developing, is the Department of Justice's hiring probe into SpaceX, specifically around regulations of non-US citizens working in the space industry. And while limits on national security specific missions are certainly understandable, do you see any reforms that are needed in how space jobs are regulated, whether it's specific changes to ITAR or other aspects?
Michael, you hit on an issue that frankly has been as long-standing as I've been in this industry, which is, at the end of the day, many of the things we do in space are for peaceful purposes, but frankly, a lot of this technology can also be used, as against us, in terms of a threat. The same rockets that take people and satellites to space are the same rockets that can carry warheads across the ocean. And so for that reason, we do have these sort of strict regulations, these so-called ITAR regulations that really limit the flow of information and limit the ability for individuals that are non-US citizens to participate in some of the most sensitive stuff that's going on. Over time, there's been a lot of really interesting debate, and I'm sure in your reporting, Michael, you're hearing from it. As technology is becoming more and more ubiquitous, and no longer it's just the United States that contain those unique technologies. There's always a tension in the system that says, should we be reforming it? Should we make it, not so closely controlled? Since after all, our allies and others are using it and might be giving them a competitive advantage. Things like, the apertures on satellites to see things in minute details. You're looking at the ground. This used to be the province of just spy satellites, but more and more, this kind of technology is becoming widely available, and it raises questions all the time. Should the regulators sort of ease off and make it easier for these things going forward? What makes it really hard is, at the end of the day, it is national security that you're often involved in. Many of the things we do at the Aerospace Corporation involve getting the appropriate clearances, and that does require that you be a U.S. citizen to get those things. But I do think increasingly there's going to be opportunities for others to participate in a way that doesn't necessarily restrict it to just that.
Well, thank you so much, Steve, for this discussion. That was a really insightful note to end on in terms of how you see these changes continuing to occur, especially as we talked about the backbone of the industry, essentially. I mean, there is no space industry without the workforce, and the issues that you present and the changes that are needed and the further partnerships that are required are really a fundamental understanding about how we continue to stimulate the growth that's happened so far. I want to thank the America's Future Space Series for hosting this conversation. I invite you to check out CNBC to look at more of my reporting on the industry. But as many of you know, this is an industry that's even bigger than just the business of space. That's just my little niche of all of this. And so I'm happy to be a part of this discussion, and I hope that we can continue talking about it more soon. Thank you all.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Michael. Appreciate you very much. The work that you guys are doing is very important. Appreciate your coverage, and we'll make sure that everybody tunes in to watch more of your great reporting.
Thank you.
We'll spread the word.